All right, let's move on to our next big story. June is Pride Month, and across the world there have been celebrations to recognize all those who identify as LGBTQ and their allies. In India as well, Pride Month serves as an occasion to talk about the ongoing fight for equality, basic rights, and, of course, the question of dignity. And this time, there's a lot being spoken about what is happening in the judiciary, what's happening legally, and on the question of rights for people of the LGBTQ community. Now, of course, there's a lot that's been happening in recent years and recent months. In 2018, of course, a landmark judgment, the Supreme Court struck down that 19th century law that had criminalized homosexuality in India. In a unanimous verdict, the Supreme Court's 5-judge bench scrapped Section 377, which the then Chief Justice Deepak Mishra described as irrational, indefensible, and manifestly arbitrary. Almost 5 years later, in April this year, the Supreme Court began hearing several petitions seeking the legalization of same-sex marriage in India. Over the course of the 10-day hearing, the petitioners argued for the inclusion of societal recognition and equal legal rights for same-sex couples in marriage. They emphasized that same-sex couples should have equal rights in financial, medical, adoption, and surrogacy matters.
I am not able to nominate my partner for life insurance. Now, these are not theoretical issues. This is our life. Right? So therefore we say marriage, because that is the notion, not only for society, but that is the notion that the legal framework, which is premised on common law, understand and takes within its fold. Therefore, my lords, respectfully, therefore the problem is that anything short of that, if it is a civil union, so this correspondence will now start, my lord.
However, the centre and some other petitioners opposed this stance, asserting that the question of marriage is a little bit more complicated. It's intricately connected to religious and cultural norms. It falls under the purview, for example, of personal laws of various religions. It says that the definition of marriage and the fundamental right to marry and the constitutional and legal implications of same-sex marriage were all questions that need to be thought about a little bit more. And all of this is, of course, extensively discussed during the proceedings. Now, that particular verdict is being written as we speak. The verdict in the case was reserved by the Supreme Court, and lots of other things came up. The Supreme Court did make some broadly sympathetic remarks, especially at the beginning, but also stated it cannot anticipate how Parliament would respond to the entire issue, and the entire question of where legislative power ends and where judicial power begins. All of that also became something that came up. So therefore, that particular verdict at the moment has been reserved by the Supreme Court.
For Hindus, it is a sacrament. For Muslims, it's a sacred contract, but nonetheless a sacred contract. And across the faith, what is recognized as a marriage is between heterosexual.
So is there at all a meeting point in all of those arguments and debates and discussions that we actually had? We are, of course, waiting for the Supreme Court's verdict, but perhaps it's time to step back a little bit and see what could actually be there in the verdict. Could there, for example, be a win-win situation in whatever the Supreme Court says that keeps all sides relatively happy? So now the temperatures have cooled a little bit, let's try and have that actual discussion. Joining me now, Mario Da Pehna is one of the petitioners in the same-sex marriage case. Mario, great to be talking to you. It is, of course, Pride Month, so this entire question is coming up. The Supreme Court's reserved its verdict while you and the other petitioners wait for that verdict to come out. What is your thinking? What are you actually expecting could happen now?
Well, we're all hoping, Vikram, thank you for having me on the show. We're all hoping for a positive outcome of some kind. That outcome can be anything from a simple declaration that marriage is a fundamental right for all Indians, or it could be something more substantial where the learned judges, wade into all the rights that married couples are given in this country, and they may make an intervention to say that these are the rights that queer people also should have. We're hoping for something on that range. I think the judges have been extremely fair to both sides in the hearings in the Supreme Court. And as activists, of course, we have nothing but hope.
Right, Maribel, at this point, I guess everyone sits and looks at what is the body language, what's likely to come out. A lot of what is said in court often does not go into the actual judgment. So what's in the actual judgment is not something we'll know until it is delivered. But when you take a look at some of what is being discussed around the entire question, obviously there seems to be a certain amount of sympathy on questions like dignity and respect and how people should be treated in a sensitive manner. Other questions are around what can happen technically, what should be left to Parliament, what happens to the specific nitty-gritties of succession and adoption, and what happens legally to that, and what the Supreme Court can say. So what are you expecting out of this? Is it basically the question of respect that should somehow be addressed?
Yes, absolutely, because it's always been a question of dignity for the community. Very often people, there was a discussion at some point between the Chief Justice and the Solicitor General, and they were thinking about giving some kinds of rights, perhaps in terms of pensions, gratuities, and they were trying to explore to what extent the government could step in. And I think while something like that would be great, of course, I think it leaves out the question of dignity that marriage grants to all citizens who, ask for that right in India. And so dignity is very central to our demands of the Supreme Court.
Mario, absolutely. Look, the question of dignity, the question of respect, I really don't think that's too much in doubt right now, especially after that landmark unanimous judgment on Section 377. The question of dignity and respect, I don't think it's something that is in doubt, and it is something that hopefully is going to come through in the verdict. What would it take in the verdict for you to say, okay, we've got what we wanted from the point of view of respect and dignity and sensitivity?
It is, for us, at least within the secular laws, when we're not making a claim on the religious laws, on the personal laws of this country, at least within the secular laws, to say that we have the right to, to get married to the people we love. That is extremely, extremely important for us. When the Special Marriage Act was being discussed in the Lok Sabha in the 1950s, Pandit Nehru actually talked about how he hoped that most Indians, even those who are not covered by the personal laws, would approach the local officials to get married under the Special Marriage Act. Now, perhaps he didn't imagine queer people approaching local officials to get married in that way. But at that time, it was mostly people who weren't covered by the religious or the caste laws of their time. So perhaps that we weren't in his imagination, but actually we do fit that definition.
All right, Mario, thank you so much for joining us. We will, of course, keep on talking about this, and we'll certainly talk once the actual verdict comes out, and we'll be trying to analyze it. Let's get a slightly different perspective on all of this. It's a great pleasure now to be joined by Swapan Dasgupta, who's been writing extensively on this entire question of same-sex marriage. He's also, of course, a senior BJP leader. Swapan, thanks so much for joining us. We're, of course, waiting for that Supreme Court judgment and for that verdict to be delivered, presumably being written right now. Many people are saying it could be a landmark judgment one way or the other. What's your own thought process? What's your expectation on this verdict?
Well, initially, I was under the apprehension that we would probably have a judgment which is so radical that it'll be difficult for society to digest. And that stemmed from some of the initial remarks made by the Chief Justice about, gender, etc., about not being.
You're talking about the time where he said there's no absolute man or absolute woman. That's what you're referring to.
Exactly, so gender is not determined by birth, is what he said. Quite radical stuff like that. And well, subsequently, I think things have been brought to a more even keel. Now, there are various issues which really have to be decided. The first one, which to me is very, very important, is that legislation, that enactment of the extension of marriage to the same-sex couples necessarily involves a redefinition of the very notion of marriage itself. It's a dramatic. It's not an insignificant modification. It changes the fundamental concept of it. Now, whether such a reinterpretation can be effected by the courts, or it needs a wider forum, notably Parliament, to discuss. Now, you can well say, why has Parliament been evading its responsibility? And I think that's a very fair question to ask. Because on the question of the decriminalization of homosexual relations, for example, 377 of the Penal Code, I believe it was Parliament which should have decriminalized it. But Parliament refused to get into that debate and allowed it to go to the courts and allowed a court judgment to set the tone. Now, are we going to see such a thing happening again here? So I think, but the point is that the demand for same-sex marriage has actually not come in any significant way from the ground. There have been some small activist groups and concerned individuals who've done it, but there's been no real stirring on the ground, unlike the question of 377 and the question of decriminalization of homosexuality. This has not happened. So we are caught in this thing. Are we imposing a minute agenda on society?
Okay, Swapan Dasgupta, let's just look at two specific things. That, for example, the petitioners and others we've been speaking to are saying, number one, it's a first and foremost a question of dignity. So allow something to happen that allows us to live with basic dignity. That's part A. Part B, yes, help us in dealing with some of the issues that come around our lives. Issues of inheritance and succession and all those many, many complicated issues that require a practical solution, which, for example, is something that the Central Committee could be helpful with. It could try and find a practical answer to those practical issues. But if the judgment comes which says, give these particular communities a certain sense of dignity to people who want to be in some sort of a union and want to live in a union with dignity, would there be a problem with that?
No, I have no problem with that. As I said, a civil partnership, anything which says that these are we shall treat these two individuals as an item, as a couple, whatever you want to call, you can use any.
How about spouse?
Any sort of terms for it. But the important thing is marriage. The definition, whether we should call it a marriage. You can call it a civil partnership. You can call it a partnership. I have absolutely. And the question of dignity, I believe, is right. They deserve that. That's a particular lifestyle they've chosen. That's a life choice they've made. And they deserve to be respected for that because they made it consciously. Now, whether the rest of society agrees with them, we cannot outlaw prejudice. You understand that. So there will be prejudice, but at least there'll be no prejudice. But that prejudice will be tempered by the fact that at least there has been some recognition that this is a legitimate union.
So you're saying that there should be a judgment that actually makes everybody happy by allowing same-sex unions to be there with dignity. Just don't call it a marriage, is what you're saying. Call them spouse or something else, and that you feel would be okay. Is that what you're saying?
Let's not go the whole hog for the moment. Because I think you need a wider consultation in society. You need to look at all the implications there is. And you've got to realize that India is also a deeply conservative society. where you've got to go at things in phases. That the most radical elements of society cannot set the tone. That's really all I'm going to say. Exercise cautious, be circumspect in what you're doing. Keep in mind the dignity of individuals, but keep in mind the sensitivities of society also.
All right, Swapan Dasgupta, thank you so much for being with us. We will, of course, wait for that verdict and then analyze it in some detail once it actually happens.